June 4, 1943. Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. The night should have been dark. Germany had lived under blackout for almost 3 straight years. Cities dimmed to embers, windows painted, street lamps extinguished. Even the glow of a cigarette could draw reprimand. Light, in wartime Germany, meant danger. Light meant British bombers. Light meant death. But when the train doors clattered open in the humid Texas evening, the prisoners stepped into a world that seemed impossible. Every storefront was lit with rows of bright electric bulbs. Neon signs buzzed in reds and blues above diners and drugstores. Gas stations glowed like polished chrome temples, and on the hills beyond, hundreds of homes shone with warm, steady rectangles of yellow light. It looked, one prisoner later wrote, as though the constellations of heaven had fallen to earth and made their home in Texas. The men stood frozen on the platform, hundreds of veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps, staring at the lights as if they were witnessing sorcery. Their boots clanged against steel, but they hardly noticed. The light alone was enough to unsteady them. Their minds had been trained to expect ruin, rationing, darkness. Instead, the United States greeted them with illumination so abundant it felt wasteful. One prisoner, a schoolteacher from Hanover, whispered to another, "This cannot be real. The Americans must be staging this for our benefit." He later wrote in his hidden diary, "No nation at war could possess such abundance while fighting on 2 fronts. It contradicted everything we believed about the world." He was wrong. That night in Mexia, Texas, population barely 7,000, 1,850 German prisoners walked into a reality that would shatter their worldview. They expected cruelty. They found organization. They expected famine. They found abundance. They expected a fragile, decadent America. They discovered a continent-sized industrial colossus that hardly seemed to notice it was fighting a global war. What happened to them over the next months would destroy Nazism, not with bullets or bombs, but with refrigerators. For many Germans, North Africa had been a place of pride, light switches, and factory assembly lines. This is the story of the German soldiers who discovered that the most powerful weapon in the American arsenal was prosperity. To understand the shock of that night, we must go back to its beginning. May 1943. Tunisia. The desert wind carried the smell of diesel, spent cartridges, and defeat. After months of brutal fighting across North Africa, General Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel's successor, finally surrendered 250,000 German and Italian troops. The Afrika Korps, once hailed as the Wehrmacht's finest expeditionary force, simply ceased to exist in a single afternoon, and the Americans spoke German, fluent, practiced German, because they had trained specifically for this moment. Radke later wrote that he had never seen the Wehrmacht process mend so quickly, not even during the height of its European victories. The idea that America was disorganized, undisciplined, and incapable of high-level coordination began to crumble in those first hours. But the paperwork was only the beginning. Food was the great psychological weapon of the desert. For months, German soldiers in Tunisia had seen their rations shrink. Rock-hard crusts of bread, watery soup, bitter coffee substitutes. Fuel shortages prevented supply convoys. Allied bombers destroyed depots faster than the Germans could build them. Some soldiers survived on less than 1,200 calories a day. So when the prisoners reached the American-run cages, the food lines felt unreal. White bread, soft, fresh, real American bread. Hot coffee, not ersatz, but actual coffee. Meat, twice a day. Jam, fruit, sugar. One officer wrote home, "We believe the Americans were trying to impress us with special rations. We did not yet understand that this was simply their normal soldiers' food." Feldwebel Radke remembered an American medic telling him, "Don't worry, Sergeant. In the United States, nobody starves unless he wants to." Radke thought it was a taunt. He would soon learn it was simply the truth. When Liberty ships arrived to carry the prisoners to the United States, rumors spread through the cages like wildfire. Many believed they would be paraded through New York as trophies. Others believed they would be forced into starvation labor. A few believed they would be executed at sea, but most believed something else entirely. This is all a staged illusion. According to Nazi propaganda, America was weak, racially divided, poorly organized, and near economic collapse. The abundance around them, food, medicine, paperwork, language training, could not be real. It had to be a trick. One POW later put it bluntly, "We assumed the Americans were deceiving us. We still believed Germany had the stronger economy. We had no idea what was coming." The voyage across the Atlantic delivered yet another shock. The U-boats had already been defeated in the Battle of the Atlantic. Something many German soldiers refused to believe until they saw the ocean with their own eyes. The Allied convoys stretched as far as the horizon. Radke counted more ships in a single day than he had seen in his entire military career. Cargo vessels, destroyers, escorts, supply tankers. It was a floating city of steel, and the Americans were still building more, twice as fast as Germany could sink them. For the Germans, the realization came slowly but painfully. They were seeing only a fraction of America's industrial power. They had pushed the British back toward Egypt, won improbable victories against superior numbers, and earned reputations as professionals even among their enemies. But war is not a story of pride. It is a story of logistics. The German supply lines had withered. The Allied air forces owned the sky, and when the end came, it came suddenly. Among the captured was Feldwebel Friedrich Radke, a veteran non-commissioned officer. He had fought in France in 1940, survived aerial bombardments, been wounded twice in North Africa, and endured the retreat across the desert. He had seen men die in sandstorms, watched tanks burn in the night, and buried friends beneath dunes that would never release their bodies. He expected captivity to bring hunger, humiliation, and brutality. He expected punishment for resisting interrogation. He expected misery. Instead, his first shock came before he even left Africa. The makeshift wire enclosures near the Algerian port of Oran were not what the prisoners imagined. They did not resemble the penal cages their own army built in Russia. They did not resemble what propaganda had warned them about in the degenerate, mongrelized America. Instead, what struck them first was the efficiency. American clerks sat at wooden tables, processing thousands of prisoners a day with assembly line precision. Identity cards were filled out, photographs taken, fingerprints stamped, possessions catalogued. When the ships reached American shores, the prisoners expected to see a besieged nation straining under war. Instead, they saw something else. A wealthy, sprawling, untouched world. No ruins, no bombed-out harbors, no smoke-blackened factories, no ration-starved civilians. Just clean ports, calm workers, and trains ready to take them inland. Those trains would eventually deliver them to Mexia, Texas, where the sight of electric light would finally break the last of their illusions. The train ride from the East Coast to Texas lasted days, and for the German prisoners, each new mile deepened the same impossible realization. America was not a nation exhausted by war. America was a nation accelerating in spite of it. From the barred windows of their rail cars, they watched landscapes that seemed to stretch forever. Endless fields, miles of farmland, towns with gas stations, diners, and shops that operated as if war were a distant rumor. Every town had lights, cars, paved roads. Every mile seemed to hum with motion. The scale alone overwhelmed them. Germany was a nation of tight borders and limited land. America looked infinite. Feldwebel Friedrich Radke wrote in his diary, "Germany is fighting for survival on a starving continent. America is fighting a war while appearing to grow stronger with every kilometer." The prisoners had not yet reached Texas, but their indoctrination was already cracking. For all its vastness, one detail struck the POWs hardest: food. At nearly every stop, American personnel loaded supplies onto the train: crates of fruit, loaves of bread, tins of meat, barrels of fresh water, sacks of flour. The sheer quantity seemed impossible. One German lieutenant asked a guard, "Is all this for us?" The guard laughed. "For you? Hell no, that's for us. That's for, you've got your own car full." It wasn't a threat. It was a simple statement of fact. And indeed, the German prisoners received meals better than anything they had tasted in months. Beef stew, potatoes, vegetables, cornbread, and actual butter. To men who had survived on desert scraps, it felt like a dream. Some whispered that America must have stripped its civilian population of food to impress them. They did not yet understand that American civilians were rationed on paper, but in practice still ate better than most European soldiers. It would take them weeks to accept this reality. When the train finally rolled into Mexia, Texas, the sun was sinking, but the night refused to be dark. Electricity was everywhere. The light seemed to cling to every surface: billboards, storefronts, telephone poles. The prisoners had seen lights in the ports and towns along the railway, but Mexia was the first moment they truly stood among them. As they stepped off the train, a POW named Hans Schreiber muttered. The camp itself sat on the outskirts of town. Rows of barracks stood neatly aligned, surrounded by barbed wire. Guard towers overlooked the grounds. Yet despite the fencing, the camp looked startlingly clean, almost sterile, almost comfortable. The first order given to the prisoners was simple. Line up. You will be fed, examined, and assigned quarters. Simple, direct, efficient. And then another shock awaited them inside. The camp infirmary operated with a level of hygiene and technology that stunned the prisoners. Nurses, some civilian, some military, took blood pressure with pneumatic cuffs the Germans had never seen. Thermometers were plentiful. Bandages were clean and new. Antibiotics were not rationed. The German Wehrmacht had competent field medicine, but shortages plagued every corner of its operation. By 1943, German doctors often sterilized equipment with campfires and reused supplies until they disintegrated. Here, the Americans discarded used materials after a single application. One POW asked a medic, "Why not save the bandage? It is still good." The medic shrugged. "We have plenty." Plenty. The word echoed in the prisoners' minds. Abundance wasn't just a rumor. It was visible in every drawer, every cabinet, every unused pile of supplies. Dinner that night became legendary among the prisoners. Plates were handed out, and the food that followed felt like something from another world. Thick slices of roast beef, mashed potatoes with real butter, green beans, soft rolls, iced tea, peach cobbler. The German officers sat speechless. Many were Iron Cross recipients, veterans hardened by years of conflict. Yet they could not process what they were seeing or tasting. One sergeant whispered, "This is better than civilian food at home." Another added, "Better than officers' mess." A third corrected him, "No, this is better than anything in Germany now." That realization was the first moment the prisoners felt fear, not for their safety, but for their beliefs. If America could feed prisoners this well, how much more could it feed its soldiers, its factories, its entire population? The question gnawed at them. The next morning, the prisoners discovered another unsettling truth. American guards did not behave like their propaganda had described. The guards were firm, alert, and armed, yet astonishingly casual. They did not beat prisoners. They did not scream. They did not force labor with threats. They simply enforced rules and expected the prisoners to follow them. When a German officer asked why the guards were not more punitive, one American replied, "Why would we? The war's over for you." The words carried a strange, unexpected mercy. In German POW camps, especially those holding Soviet captives, brutality was the norm. Violence was routine. Survival itself was a daily negotiation. But here in Texas, the Germans found structure instead of cruelty. A POW named Otto Kessler wrote home, "The Americans treat us as men, not animals. It is as though they are trying to win us, not break us." He didn't know how right he was. Every German prisoner knew the Geneva Convention. They had been told that Germany followed it, while the Allies did not. They expected the Americans to mock, ignore, or violate its terms. Instead, the Americans enforced it meticulously. Adequate calories, clean water, freedom of worship, access to mail, medical treatment. No, forced labor beyond non-military tasks, protection from humiliation, discipline through rules, not violence. To the POWs, this felt surreal. Radke wrote, "The Americans follow the Geneva Convention more faithfully than the Germans ever did." This was not propaganda. It was something worse for Nazi ideology. It was the truth. The first week in Mexia produced the earliest cracks in Nazi belief systems. 3 shocks hit the prisoners in sequence. 1. America's abundance was real, not a stage play. They saw it in meals, lights, medicine, and supplies. 2. American efficiency equaled sometimes surpassed German military order. Processing thousands of prisoners, organizing camps, maintaining logistics. 3. American treatment of prisoners contradicted everything they believed about their enemy. No brutality, no starvation, no chaos. For men raised on propaganda about American weakness, degeneracy, and racial decay, the contrast between belief and reality was catastrophic. Some clung desperately to old ideas, most wavered. A few broke almost immediately. But the true psychological demolition had not yet begun. It would come from something even more shocking than food, medicine, or electricity. It would come when they were sent outside the fences. After several days of orientation, the prisoners were assigned to labor detachments, completely legal under the Geneva Convention so long as the tasks were non-military. These detachments would send them into towns, farms, factories, and public works projects across Texas, and many prisoners did not want to go, not because they feared the work, but because they feared what they might discover. One German corporal confided, "Every day we see more of this country, and every day we understand our newspapers lied to us." The first labor assignment would become the turning point, the moment where Nazi ideology began collapsing at scale. The psychological breaking point did not arrive with a single moment of awe. It arrived in 100 small shocks, each one chipping away at the propaganda the prisoners had carried across an ocean. But there was one moment that towered above all the rest. The day the German POWs were sent into the American heartland. Early one morning, a column of prisoners marched out of the gates under guard, boarded trucks, and rumbled down a dirt road that cut through the Texas countryside. They expected hardship. They expected exploitation. They expected to be used as replaceable labor. Instead, they arrived at a family farm that, by German wartime standards, resembled a small industrial enterprise. The land stretched so far the horizon swallowed it. Wheat as high as a man's waist swayed in perfect rows. A barn the size of a German warehouse stood beside a house with a broad porch and electric lights. But it was the tractors that stunned them. Not the old, sputtering machines common in Europe, but gleaming, gasoline-powered beasts, John Deere and Farmall models, lined up in perfect rows, capable of plowing more land in a day than a dozen men could manage in a week. Radke stared at one machine and muttered, "We do not have anything like this at home. Not even officers have seen such a tractor." The American farmer chuckled. "Those? Hell, those are last year's models." The Germans thought he was joking. He wasn't. What the POWs saw that morning was the heart of America's hidden power, mechanization. By 1943, U.S. farms used more tractors than the rest of the world combined. Agricultural yields per acre were among the highest on Earth. Food production increased during the war, not decreased. In Germany, farm work had become a desperate struggle. Women, old men, and children bent over fields with hand tools because machinery had been requisitioned for the front. Horses had replaced engines. Yields had plummeted. But here in Texas, the prisoners watched a single machine do in 1 hour what 20 German laborers could barely do in a day. One POW shook his head and whispered to another, "If America farms like this everywhere, then we never had a chance." And he was right. Around noon, the farmer's wife rang a bell from the porch, calling the workers in for lunch. The Germans assumed they would be fed scraps or leftovers. Instead, they were handed heaping plates. Roast chicken potatoes, corn on the cob, green beans, bread baked that morning cold, milk. Luxury unimaginable. In Germany, slices of pie large enough to shock even the Americans. The prisoners stared at the meal in silence. One finally murmured, "We are captives, and we eat better than German civilians." The farmer's wife overheard this and replied kindly, "You boys need the strength. The sun's no joke." Such human warmth from an enemy was more disorienting than the abundance. At the end of the day, the farmer paid the U.S. Army for the POW labor. It was a standard arrangement. He received much-needed workers, the Army received funds, and the prisoners earned canteen credits. As the Germans prepared to board the truck back to camp, the farmer tipped his hat and said, "You fellas work hard. You're good men. War's a mess. But men are men." To POWs raised on propaganda about American degeneracy, the sincerity was overwhelming. Radke later wrote, "I had been taught that Americans were crude barbarians, Yet here was a man with nothing to gain treating us as neighbors. It was the first crack in the emotional wall that separated them from the America they were now living in. A few weeks later, another group, including many of the same POWs, was sent to a different type of labor site, a factory, not a munitions plant, that was forbidden by the Geneva Convention, but a mill producing processed cotton, grain products, and machine parts. It was not even one of America's major industrial centers. It was simply an average Texas factory. And yet, what the prisoners saw there finished the destruction of Nazi illusions. The moment they entered the building, the noise hit them first. A thunderous, rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat. Machines clacked, stamped, spun, and hammered with relentless precision. Conveyor belts carried materials from station to station. Workers in coveralls moved in coordinated flows, communicating with hand signals and clipped phrases barely audible over the hum. But the true shock was the scale. Dozens of machines operating simultaneously, crates of raw material stacked to the ceiling, pallets of finished goods loaded for shipping, electric forklifts ferrying cargo with ease, warehouses larger than airfields. Germany had factories, of course. But by 1943, most were bombed, rationed, or forced into makeshift production, and none had this sense of effortless power. One prisoner tapped his friend on the shoulder and shouted over the machinery, "How many workers does Germany need for this?" His friend answered, "Hundreds." The American overseer passing by overheard the German translation and shook his head. 22, he said. 2 shifts, sometimes 3. The Germans froze. 22 workers doing what would have required hundreds in Europe. That was the moment, right then, when many prisoners understood the truth. America could outproduce the Axis on a scale that bordered on the supernatural. They had seen the results in Africa. Now they were seeing the machinery of that power with their own eyes. Late in the afternoon, one of the prisoners, a former machinist named Ernst Weber, approached an American worker during a break. "How often do these machines run?" Weber asked. "All day," the worker replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "Night shifts, too." Weber frowned. "Every day?" The American chuckled. "Roosevelt said we're the arsenal of democracy. Arsenal doesn't sleep." Weber's face paled. He knew what that meant. He knew that Germany could never sustain this level of continuous production. He whispered, "Then Germany cannot win." The American shrugged. "That's for generals to figure out. I just punched the clock." But Weber was done. His belief system had collapsed. If the machinery stunned the prisoners, the workers' lifestyles demolished their remaining illusions. During their lunch break, the Americans sat with sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, bottles of milk, Coca-Cola, fresh fruit, and chocolate bars. On some days, they brought fried chicken or steaks. One POW whispered, "German workers have not eaten like this since 1939. But the greater shock came when prisoners overheard workers discussing their weekend plans. Buying a new car, fishing trips, taking their wives to dinner, building a new porch, visiting family by driving hundreds of miles. The idea of a factory worker owning a car during wartime was almost unthinkable in Germany. The idea that he could afford vacations was pure fantasy. Radke wrote, "We believed America was full of poverty and slums, but the American working man lives better than a German officer." It was a revelation few POWs ever forgot. By late summer, there was no denying reality. Every day the Germans worked on American farms, mills, or public projects. They witnessed machines. Germany had no equivalent for food Germany could not produce. Infrastructure. Germany could not match population. Germany could not outnumber fuel. Germany could not acquire abundance. Germany could not imagine. They realized that America was not straining under war. America was thriving through it. Propaganda had lied, reality had won, and with each passing day, the POWs found themselves not resenting the Americans, but respecting them. For some, that respect turned into admiration. For others, shame. For many, it became the first step toward abandoning Nazism altogether. The climax of this story is not a battle. It is not a firefight or an air raid. It is a revelation that the world Germany believed it could conquer was far stronger, richer, and more unified than it had ever imagined. And nothing demonstrated this more clearly than one final shock, one that would echo across every German camp in America, the discovery of how America treated its enemies. The cracks in Nazi ideology began quietly. But by the late summer of 1943, after weeks of work detachments, interactions with Americans, and immersion in a world overflowing with resources, those cracks were no longer hairline fractures. They were widening into deep, irreversible breaks. The shock of abundance had done its work. Now came the consequences. Not every POW abandoned Nazism. Many clung to their beliefs, some out of fear, others out of pride. Some wrote it in diaries, some whispered it in barracks, some confessed it during interrogations. The revelation didn't come from punishment or torture. It came from observing the reality around them. Every day they lived among an America untouched by war. No bombed cities, no rationing lines, no fear of invasion, no shortages, no sense of desperation. Every day they worked alongside Americans whose standard of living surpassed even Germany's pre-war prosperity. Every day they witnessed machines and infrastructure so advanced that German efforts seemed primitive by comparison. The contrast became unbearable. A sergeant told a camp chaplain, "Our Führer promised us Germany was the future, but the future is here and it speaks English." Material abundance was one thing, but something deeper, far more uncomfortable, began gnawing at the POWs. The Americans treated them better than Germany treated its own enemies. German POWs were given decent living quarters, regular meals, medical care, religious services, recreational programs, education, classes, libraries, music and theater nights, soccer fields, access to mail, the right to be addressed by rank. These were not luxuries. They were Geneva Convention obligations, obligations the U.S. military took seriously. To prisoners who knew what German camps looked like, especially camps holding Soviet captives, this was devastating. One POW wrote, "In Germany we were told what to think. In America we were allowed to think. That is more dangerous to Nazism than any gun." Set. Nazi ideology framed geopolitics as a zero-sum game. Germany could only rise if others fell. Prosperity was finite. Land was limited. Resources belonged to those who seized them. But in America, the POWs witnessed something that made no sense within that worldview. A nation could grow richer without conquering anyone. Vast land, endless natural resources, decentralized industry, entrepreneurial culture, democratic governance, racial and regional contradictions. But a unified national identity, they watched Americans debate politics openly, something unthinkable in Germany. They saw workers unionize, protest, vote, and criticize their leaders without fear. They saw immense inequality, but also immense mobility. They saw innovation everywhere, from factory lines to farm equipment. It shattered the Nazi concept of national destiny. Radke summed it up in a single line. "We believed only conquest could create prosperity. America proved prosperity creates power." Not all POWs welcomed these revelations. Some formed secret pro-Nazi groups, enforcing ideological purity. They tore down American posters. They threatened fellow prisoners. Some even committed murders in camps across the U.S. But in Mexia, as in many camps, these radicals became isolated. Why? One POW admitted, "We realized the moral high ground did not belong to Germany." Another wrote, "To be treated with dignity by an enemy creates a debt that ideology cannot repay." The collapse of their beliefs accelerated. By autumn, many camps, including Mexia, began offering optional classes. Subjects included English, American civics, history, economics, literature, mathematics, music theory. At first, these programs simply aimed to keep prisoners occupied and reduce tensions, but something unexpected happened. The POWs discovered ideas that Nazi Germany had hidden from them. Books long banned in Germany suddenly sat on open shelves. Thomas Paine, John Locke, Mark Twain, Jack London, American newspapers, even German philosophers censored under the Nazis. A prisoner named Heinrich Kröger later recalled, "We came to America believing we were the most educated soldiers in the world. We discovered that we were the most sheltered." For many, this was the first time they encountered democratic ideas presented without distortion. It changed them. There was no indoctrination, no forced speeches, no attempts to convert prisoners to a political doctrine. Instead, the Americans did something far more effective. They let the prisoners think for themselves. They gave them time-space books, discussion groups, access to the free press, exposure to American daily life. It was a psychological masterstroke.